The left keeps wanting to give out suffering and cold this year. Meanwhile, the rest of us just want to feel the Christmas spirit. I'm Bradley James, and this is American Psychology. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. This is American Psychology, and before we begin, invite the like button over for Christmas, then proceed to steal their Who feast, their Who pudding, and their rare roast beast. Let's get into it. As we move into the new year, I really wanted to take this time to discuss something that really tends to be a heavy burden and a heavy weight that sometimes that we carry voluntarily or happens to be an unavoidable hardship. This is suffering. We all suffer at points in our life, and a lot of the suffering that we endure in our life is voluntary suffering, but we look at it as a weight and a burden that we simply must carry. So then that begs the question, well, what is voluntary suffering? Voluntary suffering is things like physical fitness or parenthood or getting up for a job or working to accomplish a goal. This is a deal and a partnership that we voluntarily engage in. And so what happens? We want to take on these things in order to accomplish something else. And whether it's physical fitness to become more healthy, a job to live a certain lifestyle, or parenthood to raise the oncoming generation, this is voluntary suffering that we engage in. And we sometimes look at it as suffering that can become detrimental. Carl Jung had stated that suffering that is not understood is hard to bear, while on the other hand, it is outstanding how much a person can endure when he understands the why and wherefore. Few people who take up their suffering intentionally find themselves overwhelmed by it. So I would argue that the statement really should be looked deeper into, and how we take on suffering. Do we intentionally try to understand it, or do we just roll with the punches? Do we let the river take us as it may? The other thing about suffering is that we often place a godlike aura or godlike standard about ourselves when it comes to type of suffering that we put on ourselves, either through shame or guilt or not accomplishing a goal. You have to think, if there's a being that is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, that what is the one thing that this being is lacking? And that is limitation. You see, if we were godlike behaviors, then we wouldn't have limits. We'd be able to go in, prosper, and go forth. But the thing about that is, suffering is needed in a sense, and I'm not talking brutal suffering that destroys the soul. I'm talking about suffering that is part of everyday life, because we are human, and so we make mistakes. We have our limitations, and trying to understand what these limitations are is important. And how we do that is trying to also understand our shadow self. See, the shadow self is a moral problem that presents an issue with our ego personality. It is the part of us that we don't want to admit to having. It is that part of us that we don't want to admit to being on the outside of the world. And sometimes, if we're not careful, the shadow can overcome us, and we become that darker part of ourselves. And so if we don't understand it, there are a few different ways that it can overcome us and bring us into a world of complete suffering and a lot of chaos that we ultimately end up falling. So to dive even deeper to understand the shadow self of us, the fragility of simply being human. And so the first thing is we have to do a lot of self-reflection to even understand what is the shadow self. What is that shadow part of us that we don't want to admit to having in the world? What is that dark part of us? And that takes a lot of just personal, in-depth sight to try and understand. But once we do, we can also understand how it can overcome us. It can overcome us in ways like disarming us through external actions. Even though we have the internal power to overcome, we feel that the externalities end up becoming more powerful, and thus we feel disarmed. Another way is by dethroning us and removing the power that we have internally, making us feel hopeless, or in a way that we are not at the state, or we are not at the level, making us feel that we are not at the top hierarchy of our own self. that we are the fool, we are the jester. And that shadow self tries to take the place internally as the king. And so to understand ourselves even more deeply, we have to do a lot of self-reflection to understand that darker part of ourselves, not only to understand it, but to accept it, to accept that it is a part of us and that without it, we wouldn't be who we are, but it is also a necessary part of it. And once we understand that part of ourself, we can understand our fragility of being a person, not being something that has everything and who has nothing, a being that has limitations. And ways in which that shadow self can overcome us is it can dethrone us, making us feel as if we are powerless. Another way is it can disarm us by doing externalities when we have internal power. It makes us feel as if that external issues are more powerful than the internal power and fortitude that we hold from within. It can disable us, making us feel unbalanced and leaving our standards to the wayside. And finally, debase us, keeping us shrouded in ignorance so that way we remain a slave of our own minds. And so these are 4 ways in which, if we don't dig deeper and try to understand our shadow self, that we can take on a lot of unnecessary suffering. Because we don't get to choose what kind of suffering we have in the world. That's simply not an option. What we do get to choose, though, is what kind of suffering we want to have. How much do we really want to suffer? And you might ask, well, Brad, how do I work through my suffering? How do I work through my suffering? It seems to be something that when suffering is bad, it's very easy to become overcome by it. And so a few ways is you can set aside a time to reflect and to think to yourself. This isn't to say that you go about all day talking about it or bringing it up. It is to set aside a time that you reflect on it, and after that or before that, you try not to think about it or bring it up. Because if you do so, you're simply going to become consumed by it. The other thing that's important is this is a time and a place. Now, this is important in that you really want to try not to do this at night or in the late evening, because otherwise you're not going to sleep. You're going to ruminate about it, and it's just simply going to swirl around and consume your mind and prevent you from sleeping, then creating more suffering, and then that just snowballs. The last thing is to set aside the unit of time in which you wish to shape your life. My favorite movie of all time has a quote that goes like this: "You may find yourself in the sun basking on the rocks one moment and suddenly slammed against those very same rocks by a storm the next. It is what you do in that moment when that storm comes that matters." And so we can take from Friedrich Nietzsche in Amor Fati, Love of Fate, to understand that there are things in life that are simply bound by fate, and these things can produce unavoidable suffering or suffering that is voluntary. But we are in control of how much suffering we wish to endure. And a good way of doing so is to recognize the shadow self, the self within, that part of us that we don't want to admit to having, that part of us that we don't want to admit to ourselves or to others, that this is us. So if we can do this, then we can limit our suffering internally and therefore not add to more hell in the world than there has to be. But I'm not the arbiter of truth. These are just seeds for you to take and plant if you wish. So that's going to be it for today, guys. If you guys could please hit the like button on your way out, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that way you get new notifications every time we post a new video, and we'll see you guys next time.